From 1941 to 1945, the United States concentrated its energies on the conduct of a demanding global war. The American people turned their full attention to the job of winning that war. In the Pacific Asiatic theater, U.S. fighting men pushed the enemy back to the shores of Japan itself by the summer of 1945. In early August, the U.S. brought the enemy finally to the point of surrender after some 44 months of the most grueling warfare. A number of Japan's largest cities lay in ruins. The course of aggression on which the Japanese nation had embarked some 14 years earlier had led to a tragic end. On a day most Americans will never forget, August 15th, 1945, the Third Fleet was in waters near Japan. Its commander, Admiral Bull Halsey, was impatiently waiting for the news which all the world was anxious to hear.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification.
Finally, the all-important message came through by wireless. The enemy had surrendered. The war was over. Every man in the fleet, from admiral to able-bodied seaman, felt an immense surge of relief. After nearly 4 years, U.S. fighting forces had won the victory. On August 30th, American troops of the 6th Marine Division landed on Japanese soil at Yokosuka Naval Base, south of Tokyo. U.S. officers quickly assumed control of the installation and issued orders on procedure to the Japanese officers who had been in charge. With U.S. command firmly established, the Stars and Stripes was raised over the Japanese homeland. Later that same day, a silver C-54 bearing an important passenger came into Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo. The commander of U.S. forces in the Southwest Pacific Theater, General Douglas MacArthur, had completed the last leg of the long drive to the Japanese homeland. The general was greeted by one of his most faithful field officers, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, 8th Army Commander. General MacArthur was ready and eager to take over control of the conquered country. On the U.S. battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, a Japanese delegation arrived early on the morning of September 2nd, 1945, to make the unconditional surrender official. The Japanese contingent faced an impressive array of Allied officers. The ceremonies were directed by the new Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Japan, General MacArthur, who took a firm attitude toward the conquered people.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
Representing the Emperor at the proceedings which concluded the costliest war in world history was Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who formally surrendered for his country, thus committing Japan to accept the Potsdam Declaration, calling for the complete disarmament and surrender of all military forces. A few hundred U.S. servicemen witnessed the climax of 4 years of war in the Pacific. That war ended officially at 8 minutes past 9 a.m. on September 2nd, 1945.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
The formal surrender of the Japanese nation on the deck of the Missouri was followed by other dramatic surrender ceremonies. On Rota Island in the Marianas, one of the many groups of Japanese troops on bypassed islands gave themselves up to the victorious Americans. Great quantities of Japanese weapons and equipment were taken over by the GIs, and the enemy soldiers taken into custody, preparatory to being returned to Japan. The last man off Wake Island, Colonel Walter Baylor, was the first man back. The Japanese garrison surrendered the island to U.S. forces on September 4th, 45, 3 years and 8 months after other Japanese troops had seized the island, in a battle which will live long in the memory of all Americans. In Malaya and throughout the Southeast Asia Command, British Commonwealth forces accepted the surrender of the Japanese troops. Although they conformed to the surrender protocol, many of the Japanese in this theater did not feel they had been defeated. Singapore was the setting for the principal ritual in Lord Mountbatten's command. The Union Jack flew proudly over this British colonial city, which had been beaten into submission in early 1942. In the Philippines, General Jonathan Wainwright arrived after a quick flight from Japan to accept the surrender of the Japanese forces in those islands. Forces commanded by General Tomoyuki Yamashita. The ceremony at the Philippine summer capital at Baguio in northern Luzon took just 11 minutes. The once feared Tiger of Malaya surrendered the remnants of his army in the Philippines. This was a long-awaited moment for General Wainwright, who had surrendered the Philippines 40 months earlier, and for Britain's General Percival, who had surrendered Singapore. Immediately as prisoners of war. Japan wore the face of a conquered nation. The country's traditional way of life, which had prevailed for centuries, was altered overnight. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur became the new ruler of a people who were accustomed to swearing allegiance to one person, whom they considered supreme. The general was well suited to his role, supreme commander of an occupation charged with exacting complete obedience from 80 million subjects of a nation which had until recently been a fanatical enemy. Technically, the Supreme Commander was to be advised by a council of representatives of the 4 allied powers which had waged war against Japan. But actually, this body was impotent from the start. The delegates were constantly at odds, and any recommendations they made were given scant attention. The deposed ruler of the Japanese people, Emperor Hirohito and the Empress Nagako, were stripped of their divinity by the occupation. but it was decided not to try the emperor as a war criminal. With the royal authority curtailed, the emperor had more time for his study of marine biology. The sparing of the emperor, still revered by his people, proved a good political move by the occupation. But Japan's top war leaders received far different treatment. The men charged with the responsibility for guiding Japan onto the road of aggression were taken in hand promptly by the occupation. The number one war criminal was General Hideki Tojo, wartime premier. On November 12, 1948, after hearings which lasted 2.5 years, the International Military Tribunal convened to pass sentence on some of the top Japanese war leaders. Premier Tojo was charged with the planning, preparation, initiation, and waging of aggressive war, and with violations of the laws and customs of war, and crimes against humanity. But by assuming full responsibility for the war, as charged, Tojo reestablished his reputation for loyalty and courage. Finally, after the great mass of evidence had been sifted, the court pronounced sentence on the accused.
Accused Tojo Hideki, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East sentences you to death by hanging.
The occupation's job of controlling 80 million people who had until recently hated America and Americans went smoothly. The once despised GIs were assisted by Japanese police who had been judged trustworthy. The Japanese people seemed to reconcile themselves quickly to the fact that the war was over and they had lost. The country's most immediate post-war problem was one of sustaining life, a problem Japan had in common with a number of other Asiatic lands. Nippon's 80 million people simply could not produce enough food to keep themselves alive. In the years following the end of the war, the Japanese were able to supply only about 3/4 of the food necessary for the population of the home islands, existing on a meager diet. One possible source of food expansion lay in the removal of restrictions on the permitted fishing area. The yield from the seas could conceivably be boosted above pre-war levels. Agriculturally, the situation was less flexible. The occupation had initiated a program of land reforms, which seemed a hopeful experiment. But the basic problem remained: not enough arable land, and the farmer's small income was drained by increased food and tax collections. Most Japanese, like Hiroshi Akabane, took a philosophical view of the situation.
We Japanese have always been frugal people. But after the end of the war, many of our men, women, and children went hungry. Many starved during the first half year. Considering that we are a conquered nation, most of our people felt they were lucky to be still alive. Of course, our people all hoped to live better at some future time. And now that the war is over and out of the people's minds and hearts, we can work toward making our life better than it is today on our islands, which we once called Mizuho no Kuni, land of plentiful rice. The American soldiers became very popular in Japan. Most of my people found them friendly and kind. There was no unhappiness in our association with them. Japan was greatly helped by their presence. The important officers of the occupation were very kind to our Japanese diplomats and businessmen, who were given much advice by those officers. With their help, Japan struggled to build a new democratic nation.
The Japanese Diet convened on September 4th, 1945, for the first time since the surrender. The Diet voted in favor of bills calling for an end to many long-standing Japanese laws and customs, always following directives from the U.S. Supreme Commander's office. The new Japan's leading political figure, Premier Shigeru Yoshida, had opposed the militarist clique and was thus in high favor with the occupation. While the operation of the Japanese Diet and Cabinet gave all appearances of actively guiding the country, in actual fact, they were simply rubber stamps endorsing policies originating with the occupation. Japan's political leaders were dependent completely on occupation approval. The course of Japan's political progress was not entirely smooth. A small but active communist group operated openly. The Japanese communists were more interested in their own objectives in Japan than in relations with Moscow. Some party leaders, like Sanzo Nosaka, were denounced by Russia. The Japanese communist paper, Akahata, was eventually suspended by occupation authorities. But the party itself was never formally outlawed. It was felt that it was far wiser to permit its members to demonstrate openly than to give their movement impetus by driving it underground. But in time, the activities of the party were rigidly checked. None of the party leaders was permitted to hold political office. The communist movement in Japan never became a matter of grave concern. Beginning in 1946, with the return from the USSR of Japanese prisoners of war, the ranks of Japan's communists swelled temporarily. These men had been forcibly indoctrinated during their stay in Russian territory. But any enthusiasm for communism the soldiers may have had usually evaporated quickly in the stimulating climate of the new Japan. One of the first jobs the occupation concentrated on was instructing the Japanese in the ways of democracy. This introduction to an entirely new concept of acceptable conduct was received with interest by the Japanese. Japanese women walked alongside their husbands rather than a few paces behind. Romance blossomed spontaneously. Japanese girl often met Japanese boy informally, without any prearranged plan on the part of the parents. In the new Japan, women led active lives outside their homes, in addition to caring for their families. In the best American tradition, Japanese politicians campaigned for election. Although the privilege of helping select a candidate for office was still not fully appreciated by many Japanese people, they seemed to enjoy the procedure. In the new Japan, women were given the vote. Beginning in 1946, thousands of women who suddenly had political and legal rights by order of the government went to the polls. Some of the new voters cast their ballots for the same candidates their husbands backed. Some others voted exclusively for women candidates. In the first general election, women won 39 seats in the Diet. Anything American, even the square dance, was seized on with great determination by Japanese of all ages. In their effort to become really democratic, the Japanese solemnly aped all the outward manifestations of American life. Concluding that coeducational schools were part of the democratic system, the Japanese made many schools coeducational. Schools for students of one sex were quickly transformed to accommodate both. From the very beginning of the occupation, the GIs themselves were the best advertisement for democracy. Overnight, the American soldiers changed in the eyes of the Japanese people. No longer were they the despised enemy. In this lightning transformation, they became the heroes of the new Japan.
Japanese children grew especially fond of American soldiers. In Tokyo and other large cities, there are reminders of America everywhere you look. American motion pictures again became popular with the people all over Japan.
There is no doubt that the Japanese were genuinely fascinated with the trappings of American civilization. But this enthusiasm for things American in no way replaced the people's devotion to their traditional culture. Japan's age-old culture still exerted a powerful attraction. Whether democracy could be successfully superimposed over such a strong national tradition in a few short years was questionable. But certainly the impression made by the American GIs on the Japanese people will be a lasting one. For centuries, most Japanese have been ardent Buddhists. And today, the majority of the population is Buddhist. In addition, many Japanese participate in Shinto, the worship of innumerable gods, modern as well as ancient. Before and during the war, the leaders of the government diverted this worship to their own purposes, the furthering of the war effort and the building up of the militarists and their program. In post-war Japan, Shinto is as strong as ever, but minus the elements of state Shintoism. In Kyoto, as in most large Japanese cities, Shinto festivals are held at various times of the year in honor of specific gods. This Gyun festival in Kyoto, Japanese cultural center, honored a god of prehistoric times. The occupation was particularly concerned with getting Japanese industry back on its feet. Labor unions were formed with the approval of the occupation. But when they showed signs of becoming too strong, their powers, such as the right to strike, were severely curtailed. But the life of the worker in post-war Japan is improving as Japan moves toward its economic recovery. In the first years of the occupation, monopolies were made illegal, but gradually the influence of the zaibatsu, the pre-war industrial magnates, again became strong. In the new Japan, there was a decidedly conservative cast to the leadership of Japanese industry, matching the situation in Japanese political life. Considering the circumstances which existed at the end of the war, the accomplishments of the occupation in helping effect Japan's recovery have been notable. Most Americans in Japan find it hard to be sure what the Japanese people really think about democracy and the democratic institutions and habits they have acquired. It is still too early to determine whether democracy will really take root in Japan. Whatever the occupation's achievements prove ultimately to be, the U.S. has successfully transformed an enemy nation into an ally and gained the most important bastion against communism in the Far East. The urgent need for a military foothold in the Orient grows more apparent with each passing month. All over Eastern and Southern Asia, the end of World War II was followed by eruptions of nationalism, eruptions which the Soviet Union in some areas turned to its own purposes. Under the Japanese occupation during much of World War II, The doctrine of Asia for the Asiatics was spread across Eastern and Southern Asia. During this period, the people of many Asiatic lands had their thirst for independence whetted. That yearning for freedom was seized upon by the opportunistic Japanese leaders in their campaign to stimulate the people to hatred of the Allies. With the end of World War II, the stirrings of nationalism flared into eruption throughout most of Southern and Eastern Asia. In the spring of 1945, American and Australian bombers opened up on Borneo, the largest island in the invaluable Dutch East Indies. Borneo, strategically located between Malaya and Australia, was an important invasion target. Allied warships performed their familiar prelude to invasion. Australian soldiers went ashore at several points on the large island and drove inland against spirited resistance. Tank infantry teams made rapid progress. On June 10th, General MacArthur landed on Labuan Island off British North Borneo and congratulated the Australians on a job well done. Japanese domination over the peoples of Asia was nearing an end. With the end of World War II, the islands of the East Indies, which had been ruled by the Dutch before the war, became the new independent nation of Indonesia in the eyes of the people of those islands. In Yogyakarta, Java, Ahmed Sukarno, the native leader during the Japanese occupation, and a group of associates, proclaimed the independence of the Isles of the Indies. The nationalists consolidated their position quickly. Everyone available was enlisted to work in the common cause, the setting up of a functioning government strong enough to withstand any attacks upon it by the Allied forces scheduled soon to arrive. The nationalists were determined to stand their ground. In December 1945, the first Dutch troops arrived in the Indies, 4 months after Japan surrendered. The Dutch Marines were assigned to take over the job of keeping order and restoring the islands to Dutch rule, a job which had been performed by British troops until the arrival of the Dutch Queen's forces. The men went right to work in an attempt to quell the insurgents' rebellion. At Cirebon, on the island of Java, Dutch and Indonesian leaders effected a partial compromise of differences and a ceasefire in the Linggadjati Agreement. But that condition did not last long. Dutch troops moved into territory acknowledged to be Republican by the terms of the agreement. The Dutch police action resulted in a renewal of violence. A settlement of differences between the Dutch and Indonesians seemed more remote than ever. Bridges were destroyed by the retreating natives. The Indonesians ravaged their own land rather than have it prove useful to the Dutch. In mid-1947, the United Nations attempted mediation. Australia's delegate, William Hodgson, called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and peaceful arbitration. But the issue was far from being settled. The communists in Indonesia, who had been supporting the nationalists in their fight for independence, rebelled. The Republican troops went to work quickly, rounding up every communist they could locate. The uprising was ineptly staged, and within a month it was decisively crushed by the Indonesian Republican forces. With its leaders either captured or killed, the communist force collapsed, and the threat to the success of the nationalist cause ended. In December 1949, the islands of the Indies officially became the Republic of the United States of Indonesia. Elected president by the 16 Nagaras of the Federation of Indonesian States, Sukarno was sworn in a ceremony at Yogyakarta. The new ruler, who had collaborated with the Japanese, had been striving toward this day for some 30 years. Finally, after 4 years of fighting and negotiating, he and his people were officially recognized as an independent nation. In Indonesia, as elsewhere in Asia, colonialism was dying. India had been working toward an independent status for several decades. With World War II, the stirrings of nationalism throughout Southern Asia accelerated the tempo of that movement. The people of the subcontinent of India had been promised a certain degree of self-rule by the British. Finally, on August 15, 1947, Jawaharlal Nehru represented India's millions at the ceremony in which Britain's Lord Mountbatten presented India her sovereignty. The new India became an important member of the British Commonwealth of Nations, but Britain no longer ruled the vast territory which held a dominant position in Southern Asia. In Karachi, Lord Mountbatten attended another ceremony to celebrate the creation of a new independent nation. Mohammed Ali Jinnah and some 75 million supporters, mostly Muslim, were at last the masters of their own destiny as the sovereign nation of Pakistan. The new Muslim nation of Pakistan was carved out of parts of what had been the India of the British Empire. The balance of the Indian colonial territory became the new Hindu nation of India. But freedom for the peoples of the Indian subcontinent was accompanied by rioting and bloodshed. Hundreds of thousands died in these fierce clashes between the Muslims and Hindus over the division of the land between Pakistan and India. Some of the territory at issue became a no man's land. Millions of natives left their homes to move to an area where their religion was honored. Muslims poured into Pakistan, and Hindus caught within the borders of the new Muslim nation migrated to the new India. For many, the move meant uprooting their lives, but no sacrifice was too great to make for their religious freedom. India's independence was a high point in the life of Mohandas Gandhi, the spiritual leader of the nation's millions and its most powerful nationalist leader. Passive resistance was Gandhi's approach, a doctrine he practiced with great effect in furthering the cause of nationalism. But in January 48, Gandhi was assassinated by a member of an extremist faction. India had lost her steadiest guiding hand. Thousands upon thousands paid homage to India's great leader. The mourners included not only Hindus, but Muslims, Sikhs, and Britons, who sincerely believed that the world had lost a great man. In Pakistan, as in India, strong efforts were made to effect conciliation of differences between the two nations. But in Kashmir, a disputed province, the strange situation flared into open warfare. To the Western world, Kashmir had long been a fabled, remote land. In 1947, Kashmir's Maharaja refused to accede to either India or Pakistan, and the fight was on. Indian armed forces arrived to combat the Muslim troops from Pakistan. In the closing months of 1947, the disturbance turned into a real war. On January 1st, 1949, through the efforts of the United Nations, a ceasefire was effected. Pakistan refused to withdraw its troops from the disputed province when India declared its intentions of keeping its soldiers in the area. Pakistan held some economic advantages over India, for in East Pakistan, the bulk of the world's jute is grown. Pakistan's supply of this precious fiber, no longer sent to India, was now shipped directly overseas. Both nations underwent rigid economic readjustment. Even India's fabulously wealthy Maharajas felt the pinch. They were stripped of much of their political power and some of their wealth. But India's former ruling classes still managed to lead a luxurious existence, far removed from the lot of the untouchables at the lowest level of Hindu life. For millions of India's people lived on only a few grains of rice. On January 26, 1950, the Republic of India was established. India had been a free nation for almost 2.5 years, but this ceremony heralded the severing of the bond with the British Crown.
That on and from this, the 26th day of January 1950, India, that is Bharat, shall be a sovereign, democratic republic.
The raising of the flag of the Republic's first president symbolized complete freedom to the Indian people. In Burma, which was granted its independence by Britain in 1948, a struggle for control was waged by about a dozen political factions of varying shades, including 2 communist groups. In nearby Malaya, Britain continued to rule. But its colonial administration was constantly challenged by communist guerrillas operating from the hills. British and colonial troops were pressed into service to protect Malaya's rubber plantations and tin mines from the raids of the guerrillas. But the soldiers had difficulty in coming to grips with an enemy which disappeared into thin air, or so it seemed to the colonial troops. In the years following the defeat of Japan, Britain's control of the Malay Peninsula was far from strong. The Philippine Islands had been promised their independence by 1946. But with the Japanese invasion and conquest of the islands, the people's hopes dimmed. But in spite of that strong setback, the Philippines celebrated their independence just as planned on July 4th, 1946.
With this ceremony, a new nation is born. A nation conceived in the centuries-old struggle of a people to attain the political liberty to embark upon its own national destiny. A nation upon whom the eyes of all oppressed peoples are today cast with the burning light of a new faith.
The formal declaration of Philippine independence was made by U.S. Commissioner Paul McNutt.
I am authorized and directed by the President of the United States to proclaim the independence of the Philippines as a separate and self-governing nation.
The infant republic experienced the customary growing pains during those first heady months of freedom. Philippine political life still reflected the upheaval caused by the war and the Japanese occupation. In fact, one of the election issues, in addition to government corruption and the control of communism, was the degree of collaboration with the Japanese indulged in by one or another of the candidates. The Philippine political picture remained muddled for many months. The first president of the Republic was Manuel Rojas, who had worked with the Japanese, but was cleared by General MacArthur. The Hukbalahaps constituted the government's biggest headache. Once strongly anti-Japanese, the Huks now trained their sights on the new government and its policies. With the end of World War II, French Indochina seemed destined for a revival of French colonial administration. In the French Empire, no colony was more desirable than Indochina, General Jacques Leclerc, the liberator of Paris, arrived in Indochina in late 1945 to conduct mopping-up operations against the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese were ardent nationalists who lived in an area comprising almost half of French Indochina. The bitter clashes with the French troops marked the start of a full-scale war which continued for some 17 months. The French proclaimed their control and backed up their statements by force of arms. French soldiers were fighting in dead earnest. For Frenchmen, no part of the war-ravaged colony was entirely safe. The military operations the French were conducting against the Vietnamese were in no way dissipating the natives' desperate urge for freedom from French colonial rule as they had known it before the Japanese occupation. Most of the fighting was in Vietnam, which includes 3 of the 5 countries comprising pre-war French Indochina. Finally, on June 14, 1949, the independent state of Vietnam, under Bao Dai, former Emperor of Annam, was recognized by the French as independent, but existing within the French Union. But to the natives of Vietnam, even this limited form of independence under a leader who did as directed by the French was some improvement over pre-war French colonial rule. The age-old countries of Cochin China, Annam, and Tonkin, united as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, embarked on a new era in the history of Southeast Asia, a period which bore only surface resemblances to the era which ended in Asia with World War II. This new day was inaugurated in Vietnam as elsewhere throughout Asia with warfare. The most urgent task facing the French and Vietnamese was the job of containing the advances of communist Viet Minh forces, which were operating in strong guerrilla groups throughout Vietnam. To the north, Asia's most troubled country, China, moved right from one war, that with Japan, to another, the war with the communist forces, without a pause. Chiang Kai-shek had led China through a series of great crises, but with the end of war with Japan, Chiang and China embarked on an even more critical period. The new antagonist, Chinese Communist Mao Zedong, gained adherents quickly. Chiang's forces fought a long, exhausting series of campaigns in a vain attempt to stop the communist advance from spreading across China. Over a period of 2 years after the end of World War II, China received hundreds of millions of dollars worth of material aid from UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. The major part of that assistance, about 2/3 of the total amount, was furnished by the U.S. In late 1945, General George Marshall arrived in China to try to effect a ceasefire between the 2 Chinese forces. At first, his mission seemed headed for success. During January 1946, a series of conferences involving both nationalists and communists achieved some positive results. On January 10th, a ceasefire agreement was reached, endorsed by the nationalists and communists in the mediator's presence. But the Marshall Mission and a subsequent survey of the problem conducted by General Albert Wedemeyer both proved inconclusive. Meanwhile, Mao's forces grew stronger while the debate raged on what U.S.-China policy should be. By early 1949, Mao commanded a formidable fighting force. In late May of that year, Shanghai fell to the advancing Chinese Communist armies. The Communist soldiers moved quickly into the heart of the city, which had been evacuated by the nationalists after they had boasted that they would defend it with the last drop of their blood. The Chinese civilians in Shanghai were quick to applaud their new masters. Overnight, Shanghai's population became ardently communistic. In Beiping in October 1949, Russia's ambassador, Roshin, presented his credentials to Mao Zedong, and the bond between the Chinese communists and the Soviet Union was cemented. Mao Zedong, once a lowly party worker, now assumed the stature of the dominant figure in all of Eastern Asia. The nationalist troops, those that hadn't joined forces with the communists, fled southward with their families. Many surrendered their weapons to the French in Indochina. The nationalist defense of China had turned into a rout. From a small area in North China, Mao's forces swept over all of mainland China. Formosa provided a haven for Chiang and the remnants of his army. Beginning in December 1949, on his island sanctuary, Chiang worked toward the day when China could be freed from the communist yoke. He had the support of the United States, but Britain, by recognizing Red China, weakened the cause of Generalissimo and Madame Chiang.
Britain has bartered the soul of a nation for a few pieces of silver. I say, for shame to Britain. One day, these pieces of silver will bear interest in British blood, sweat and tears on the battleground of freedom. For that which is morally wrong can never be politically right.
In addition to U.S. military aid for his troops, Chiang was further aided by the presence in waters off Formosa of the U.S. 7th Fleet, which was assigned by the U.S. to save the island from the communists. In Korea, which had been ruled by the Chinese and the Japanese during the past century, the end of World War II introduced two allied powers, Russia and the United States, which occupied the northern and southern sections of the country.
It is my sincere belief that our great victories on the battlefields of the world will be followed by complete cooperation and collaboration around the council tables of the great nations, resulting in continuance of world peace, and that our conferences here will solve the pressing problem of the Korean people.
I greet the Korean people who are liberated from the long oppression of the Japanese imperialists by the glorious troops of the Red Army and the army of our allies, the United States of America. General Hertz, I would like to express assurance that our negotiations with your representative will bring the solution of urgent problems having vital importance for the whole of Korea.
In North Korea, the Soviet interpretation of administration and occupation consisted of impressing communism on the country. Soon after the Russians arrived, a communist government was functioning in North Korea under such native leaders as Communist Kim Il-sung, a Russian puppet. At the end of World War II, Korea had been divided arbitrarily at the 38th parallel. South of that degree of latitude, the U.S. was the occupying power. On August 15, 1948, the U.S. made South Korea an independent republic. Most South Koreans were determined to protect that newly won freedom. In August 1948, that job did not seem too difficult. But during the first years of the infant republic's existence, the job of protecting that independence assumed larger proportions. Communist demonstrations inspired by natives in the northern half of Korea gave the first inkling of further trouble ahead. The 38th parallel of latitude was to prove a most ineffectual barrier against the sweep of communist aggression from the north. When World War II ended, Korea, ruled by Japan since 1905, was divided in half and occupied by two of the Allied powers. North of the 38th parallel, the USSR assumed the duties of maintaining order and helping the Koreans to reestablish their national entity. But the administration of North Korea, as practiced by the Russians, was characterized by much more than a friendly interest in North Korean industry and government. Soon after the start of the Russian occupation, a communist government was functioning in North Korea, guided by such native communist leaders as Soviet-trained Kim Il-sung and his henchmen. South of the 38th parallel, the Koreans made an earnest attempt to arrive at a basis for closer understanding with the occupying U.S. force. But to the South Koreans, young and old, it was difficult to comprehend the mysterious foreigners from another hemisphere who had arrived in Korea suddenly and set about introducing American methods into the life of South Korea. American occupation forces checked the spread of disease and helped the South Koreans themselves to work more effectively toward improving the national health. In South Korea, at least, the people seemed destined for a somewhat better life than they had known for centuries. By mid-1950, almost 5 years after the end of World War II, South Korea had built up an army of some 100,000 men, trained by American Army officers and non-coms. The South Koreans felt in the spring of 1950 that they could handle any attack from across the 38th parallel. But in late June, that boundary was crossed in force by the North Koreans. The communist thrust across the 38th parallel heralded the beginning of one of the most tragic periods in the history of the Korean people. The South Korean forces had proved pitifully inadequate for the job of withstanding the invaders. For the citizens of the infant Republic of Korea, whose independence had been proudly proclaimed less than 2 years before, the immediate future looked all but hopeless. The unquiet peace which had existed among the great powers of the world since World War II was at an end. In the U.S., at Lake Success, the United Nations, with the Soviet member conspicuously absent, took enforcement action against the aggressor.
48 hours ago, the Security Council, in an emergency session, determined that the armed invasion of the Republic of Korea by armed forces from Northern Korea constituted a breach of the peace. Accordingly, the Security Council called for a cessation of hostilities forthwith and the withdrawal of the Northern Korean authorities of their armed forces to the 38th parallel. It is clear that the authorities in North Korea have completely disregarded and flouted the decision of the Security Council. The armed invasion of the Republic of Korea continues. This is, in fact, an attack on the United Nations itself.
Agreed that the armed attack upon the Republic of Korea constituted a breach of the peace, the United Nations of the world took decisive action.
To secure peace and security recommends that the members of the United Nations furnish such assistance to the Republic of Korea as may be necessary to repel the armed attack and to restore international peace and security in the area.
In Korea, for the first time, enforcement action was taken against an aggressor by direction of the United Nations.
On 28 June, aircraft of the United States Air Force, operating pursuant to the resolution of the Security Council of the United Nations, began air operations against the North Korean invaders in support of the Republic of Korea forces, and later struck at military targets north of the 38th parallel with a view to disrupting the lines of communication and supply of the invading forces. The badly decimated Republic of Korea forces reformed south of the Han River, sought to delay the North Korean advance. By sheer weight of numbers and materiel, they were forced back step by step until on 2 July, the town of Suwon, 20 miles south of Seoul, was reported in North Korean hands. Meanwhile, in pursuance of United Nations recommendations, United States ground forces were committed to the area for stabilization of the front. On 5 July, a very small United States force made contact with the invaders south of Suwon. The first United States troops were small in number and were committed as a holding force only. They were followed by additional supporting forces as rapidly as these could be transported to the battle line, facing odds at times as high as 20 to 1. Our Army troops distinguished themselves in the most difficult of military operations, a delaying action.
The first UN heroes were American GIs of the 24th Division. In the deserted villages of South Korea, the nations of the free world would shortly make their stand against the forces of aggression. In Tokyo, the appointment of General Douglas MacArthur as commander of United Nations forces celebrated in a ceremony conducted by U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General Lawton Collins. During the first weeks of fighting, South Korean and American forces were pushed back toward the tip of the Korean Peninsula and the prospect of another Dunkirk. The outnumbered UN forces took heavy losses during that first month in the desperate fight for time. On July 31st, elements of the 1st Marine Division arrived at Busan, swelling the force of American fighting men in Korea to some 100,000. The battle to keep the enemy from overrunning all of Korea approached its most critical stage. Men and materiel were now arriving from the U.S. in some quantity. 7,000 miles away at Lake Success, New York, on the following day, August 1st marked the return to the United Nations Security Council of the hitherto absent Soviet member, Yakub Malik, who assumed the presidency of the Council for the month of August. The discussion of the Korean aggression flared into violent and bitter debate at intervals throughout Soviet delegate Malik's month as the Security Council's president.
The USSR delegation declares to the Security Council and to the public opinion of the world that the United States resolution is intended to extend the scale of the United States government's aggression against the Korean people.
When the president, as such, or as the representative of the Soviet Union, it makes no difference which hat he wears while he's doing it, but when he undertakes to persuade this great audience here present and in all the world outside that the United States of America is an aggressor in Korea, I'd like to ask whose troops are attacking deep in the country of somebody else? Whose troops? The North Koreans. Who is assisting the Republic of Korea to defend itself? The United Nations, with the support of 53 out of 59 members. Is the Soviet Union one of the 53? No.
The United States government is now making every effort to extend its scope to wage war on an increasingly large scale, to drag as many other governments as possible into this war, not only against the people of Korea, but also against the other people of Asia. The whole world knows that armed intervention in the internal affairs of Korean people, armed aggression in Korea, is being carried out by American forces on the personal orders of President Truman and under the command of the American General MacArthur.
Now let us consider the trick of concealing guilt through accusation. The classic example of this trick, of course, is that of the thief who is running away. And he cries, "Stop thief, stop thief," at the honest man ahead of him in order to confuse his pursuers. The Soviet delegate referred several times to, quote, "the aggression of which the United States is guilty against the Korean people," end quote. This statement has been repeated over and over through every Soviet-inspired channel on Earth. We've had it telegraphed to us by others, and we've heard it again today. It is a lie. It is a big lie to call the action of those governments who are seeking to support the resolutions of the Security Council acts of aggression is a falsehood so grotesque that even the technique of the big lie will not disguise it. The determination of the United Nations to ensure that Korea shall be free, unified, and independent of outside influence from any great power on or off the continent has never wavered. This is what the United Nations forces are fighting to uphold in Korea. It is a supreme effort to give the Korean people the right to control their own destinies, a right that so many countries caught in a net of imperialism with a new name, communist imperialism, have lost.
In Korea, the identity of the aggressor was no mystery. By late August, the North Korean forces had seized most of South Korea, except for an area surrounding the port of Busan. With their backs to the sea, American forces fought desperately to hold their ground against the powerful enemy drive. The crucial battle was fought in the hills flanking Taegu. It was a bruising fight for the bone-weary American GIs. But they never gave up the battle. In holding the Busan perimeter, the American forces suffered heavily. But the enemy offensive was beaten back. Thanks to the sacrifices of American fighting men, Korea did not become a communist peninsula. By early September, the Busan perimeter was no longer in immediate danger of being overrun. On September 15th, the tide of battle turned by virtue of a daring amphibious attack at Incheon. The attack force which made the assault on Korea's west coast was engaged in an extremely difficult operation. An operation undertaken at the insistence of General MacArthur. The problems of fluctuating tides, unpredictable currents, and narrow channels made the success of the Incheon landing a doubtful quantity. The burden of responsibility for risking the forces committed in an operation which might well prove a failure rested with General MacArthur. 12,000 Marines, many veterans of World War II, headed for shore in the first amphibious assault of the Korean War. With the Marines who stormed the beaches at Walmy and Incheon was Time Life correspondent Frank Gibney, also a veteran of the war with Japan.
Some of the Marines in the assault had been brought from duty in the Mediterranean. Others had been pulled out of the line in southern Korea. Incheon had to be taken to cut the enemy's communications with the southern front and to trap thousands of his troops in between. The Marines didn't give the enemy time to recover from the surprise attack on his flank. Progress was swift. Many of the Marines I was with were past masters at flushing enemy troops out of holes, an acquired talent they never lost. Hundreds of North Koreans were killed on that overcast September morning, D-Day at Incheon. The surprised North Korean troops had failed completely in their hurried attempt to beat off the amphibious attack. The operation was a spectacular success, a proud day for General MacArthur, whose judgment was vindicated, and for Marine General O.P. Smith.
On the southern front, the situation had changed considerably by virtue of the Incheon operation. For the enemy, the battle had taken a turn for the worse. U.S. 8th Army GIs smashed into enemy positions with renewed spirit and moved slowly but steadily forward. In the Incheon area, the Marines stepped up the attack in a drive to take Seoul as quickly as possible. On September 24th, only 10 days after D-Day at Incheon, U.S. Marines and soldiers were fighting in Seoul. The fight for the South Korean capital was bloody, but relatively brief. For 5 days, the battle for Seoul raged on. The U.S. troops took their losses, but efficiently stamped out enemy resistance. 3 months after the communist invasion, Seoul was once again free. Thousands returned to the homes they had abandoned before the communist thrust overwhelmed the Korean Republic's capital. Other thousands upon thousands had stayed on during the communist occupation. As soon as the fight for Seoul was ended, they fell to work, rebuilding their badly battered city. For the inhabitants of Seoul, life was a good deal more makeshift than it had been before the communist invasion. Government officials of the Republic of Korea who returned to Seoul after its recapture addressed the inhabitants, who had been subjected to daily doses of communist propaganda, on South Korea's immediate problems. During the summer of 1950, many thousands of South Koreans were killed by their countrymen from the north. Whatever the future held for Korea, it could hardly prove more tragic than the early years of the infant republic's existence. In many lands, freedom had been achieved by bloodshed, but nowhere was newly won freedom put to a stronger test than in the Republic of Korea. By early autumn, fighting forces from other member countries of the United Nations arrived in South Korea to join the struggle in defense of South Korean independence. To that crusade, Britain committed some 5,000 soldiers. Several of the nations which had fought in the Pacific during World War II sent troops to South Korea. 1,000 Filipino soldiers and 1,000 Australians swelled the ranks of the United Nations forces. The diggers from down under, who had fought so well in the steaming jungles of New Guinea 8 years before, were determined to add further laurels to their battlefield record in Korea. On October 1st, South Korean troops pushed northward across the 38th parallel, 3 months and 1 week after the communist attack. As the ROKs, Republic of Korea soldiers, seized more and more territory in their northward drive, there were impromptu celebrations commemorating the liberation of the area. The Koreans along the route seemed genuinely happy to greet the advancing ROC forces. The city of Kaesong, just south of the 38th parallel, was seized by Americans of the 1st Cavalry Division on October 8th. The GIs then drove quickly north to the well-publicized boundary, which the UN had authorized its forces to cross. By October 15th, United Nations troops had swept across the 38th parallel and seized a considerable area in North Korea. 2,500 miles east, Wake Island was the scene of a most important engagement that mid-October morning. President Harry Truman had flown 7,000 miles to talk with his top general in the Far East, a man he had never before met. They conferred for 1 hour in complete privacy, and then held a more general discussion in one of Wake Island's few buildings. This conference included the President's top military advisors, Joint Chiefs Chairman Bradley and Army Secretary Pace. Before the meeting broke up, a decoration ceremony was held, to the delight of the photographers. Though only the two men knew what had been said at the secret meeting, they claimed to be in complete agreement. On October 20th, ROC soldiers and American GIs seized the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. After 5 years, the communist hold on that city had been broken by the UN forces. 2 days later, 120 troop carrier planes transported paratroopers of the 187th Airborne Regiment to an area some 25 miles north of Pyongyang. Over the target area near Sukchan and Sunchan, the paratroopers hit the silk. General MacArthur cruised above the area, watching the initial stage of the operation. The 800-foot drop took each man only about a minute. The operation went off smoothly. The drop was made at precisely the points indicated in the original planning. The trap on the enemy was sprung. Some 30,000 North Koreans were bottled up between the UN forces in Pyongyang to the south and the men of the 187th Airborne Regiment. The North Koreans were completely taken by surprise by this unfamiliar maneuver. On North Korea's east coast, off Wonsan, U.S. minesweepers went to work on clearing out one of the most intensive sea minefields in military history. The job was done by laying magnetic lines. Finally, after a 6-day delay, the landing at Wonsan was made by advance elements of the 1st Marine Division. But this landing was not in the tradition of marine amphibious invasions, for the area had already been taken 2 weeks earlier by other UN troops. Though the landing was no problem, the Marines had been alerted to expect plenty of action when they reached shore and began the push along the east coast of the peninsula. The Marines' first assignment was to mop up a large group of organized North Korean guerrillas. The job was done efficiently by men who were experienced in that line of work. The Marines fighting along the east coast were part of the U.S. 10th Corps, a combined Marine Army force commanded by U.S. Army Major General Edward Alman, who reported directly to General MacArthur in Tokyo. On Korea's west coast, Lieutenant General Walton Walker commanded the U.S. 8th Army. Both U.S. forces were driving pell-mell toward the northern boundary of Korea. That objective received the full attention of both 8th Army and 10th Corps commanders, who did not coordinate their movements but reported independently to Tokyo. The frozen Yalu, which separates Korea from Manchuria, was reached at the North Korean town of Haesanjin by GIs of the 7th Division. Most of the men felt that this achievement signaled the answer to their prayers, the end of the war, and a chance to get home for Christmas. But the GIs did not realize on that cold November afternoon that an even greater enemy across the Yalu was about to attack. For 300 miles, the Yalu River separates Korea and Manchuria. Through the centuries, that boundary has been crossed a number of times by invaders. Most recently, in 1950, by Chinese communists, At the midpoint of the 20th century, Korea was once again a devastated country. Surrounded by powerful nations on three sides, Korea, because of its unfortunate geographical position, had been invaded and occupied 9 times. On November 26, 1950, the Chinese Reds launched a full-scale invasion against the UN forces in Korea. Some 2 million refugees again moved southward to escape the advancing communist armies. Many who had remained in their homes when the North Koreans invaded South Korea this time did not hesitate. The UN forces continued their precipitous retreat across the countryside for which they had fought so hard. In the U.S., at Lake Success, a few days after the Chinese Reds poured into Korea, General Wu Su-chuan mouthed the Chinese Communist government's party line.
On the instructions of the Central People's Government of the People's Republic of China, I am here in the name of the 475 million people of China to accuse the United States government of the unlawful and criminal act of armed aggression. It is an integral part of the overall plan of the United States government to intensify its aggression, control, and enslavement of Asian countries, a further step in the development of interference by American imperialism in the affairs of Asia. The American imperialists have always, in their relations with China, been the cunning aggressor.
While General Wu talked, the Chinese Reds were driving deep into the UN front in Korea. The communist thrust cut off UN troops on the eastern flank. 22,000 surrounded U.S. troops began an epic drive to the sea. From the territory adjacent to the Chongjin Reservoir in the mountainous terrain of North Korea, the breakout from their encircled position was begun by Marines of the 1st Division, plus elements of the U.S. Army's 7th Division. The 56-mile fight to the sea was a battle unparalleled in American military history. Across the frozen North Korean mountains, the Marines and GIs pushed grimly through the enemy-held territory. The heavily outnumbered U.S. fighting men were trapped in what looked like a hopeless situation, but they never gave up the attack. The Marines and GIs inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy force and took a considerable number of prisoners. For the Chinese communists, accustomed to fighting in cold, difficult country, the battle for North Korea was proving extremely tough, even for their most hardened troops. Aiding the U.S. drive to the sea, American planes flew countless close support missions. Air and ground elements were well coordinated. For 13 days, American forces continued their dramatic fight toward the sea. The Marines who spearheaded the breakout did not consider it a retreat. "Retreat, hell," said their commander. "We're just advancing in a different direction." Their historic march finally ended successfully as the weary troops reached the port of Hungnam on Korea's east coast. There, a sizable U.S. fleet waited offshore, ready to evacuate the American units. As much material as possible was salvaged from the beachhead, but the most important cargo, the men who had heroically fought their way out of the enemy trap, received top priority. The men felt they were lucky to be alive. The evacuation of some 100,000 troops, including the men who had driven down to the coast from the reservoir, was an extremely delicate and incredibly complex operation. The last men went aboard ship the day before Christmas. Before pulling out, the U.S. forces gave the area a final going over. The enemy would find the port in far from perfect condition. In southern Korea, thousands of American GIs spent their first Christmas away from home, looking forward to the day of their return. The men who weren't in the line celebrated in U.S. style. For some, this was their first white Christmas. But many thousands of American GIs couldn't take time off for a proper observation of the holiday. U.S. forces continued to fall back under the weight of the enemy offensive. Every effort was made to slow down that offensive. On December 26th, Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway was made commander of all U.S. ground forces in Korea. Early in 1951, U.S. forces were prepared to embark on a new counteroffensive, a campaign marked by the slogan, "Kill the Communists." In February, that killer offensive was launched from the front in southern Korea. For many of the GIs, this was the second time they were fighting back over this same ground. This marked the beginning of a tiring 6-month-long campaign for control of the area just below the 38th parallel. The ROK's Republic of Korea soldiers probed the territory ahead of the UN line in the center of the front. All along the line, the UN troops gained ground against the enemy. The battle was a seesaw affair, but UN soldiers advanced against steady resistance. The GIs of the U.S. 8th Army fought doggedly forward. In early February, the front moved to the hilly country below Seoul. On March 8th, UN troops reached the Han and Force, and U.S. engineers quickly set about throwing a bridge across the river. With the Han spanned, the advance on Seoul proceeded swiftly. UN forces intensified their attack and pushed on toward Seoul. By March 14th, they reached the outskirts of the South Korean capital. For the fourth time, Seoul was captured by an advancing force of troops, twice from the north and twice from the south. The city was beginning to show the effects of the savage fighting which accompanied each seizure. This time, Seoul fell quickly. At Tokyo's Haneda Airport, throughout late 1950 and early 51, General MacArthur greeted a number of visitors from Washington, like Army Chief of Staff Collins. The supreme commander in the Far East, Washington felt, was perhaps a little too supreme. With the general continuing to act independently, relations with his Washington superiors finally broke completely.
Why can't we take other steps to punish the aggressor? Why don't we bomb Manchuria and China itself? Why don't we assist the Chinese nationalist troops to land on the mainland of China? If we were to do these things, we would be running a very grave risk of starting a general war. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
In Tokyo, after the official order arrived, the Supreme Commander himself gave no indication that the President's action was a matter of any concern. But although the general took the news calmly, the relief of Japan's new ruler came as a shock to the incredulous Japanese people. On April 16th, the former Supreme Commander was driven through the streets of Tokyo for the last time. Japanese of all ages lined the 8-mile road to the airport to get a final glimpse of the man they had come to regard as their absolute ruler. 4 days later in Washington, both houses of the U.S. Congress and the nation at large as well prepared to hear what the general had to say for himself.
I address you with neither rancor nor bitterness. In the fading twilight of life, with one purpose in mind, to serve my country. I am closing my 52 years of military service.
The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away.
In Tokyo, meanwhile, the new Supreme Commander, General Matthew Ridgway, arrived from the Korean battlefield to assume his new duties. The new head of the Far East Command was less aloof than his predecessor had been. In Korea, the GIs were engaged in turning back a new enemy offensive. This time, the UN forces knew that the enemy's big push was coming, and they were ready for it. U.S. planes were on the alert. All along the line, UN forces hit back. The communist offensive was stopped cold. The Chinese Reds had not only failed in their attempt to retake Seoul, but their entire massive attack had been completely broken up. But for every Chinese prisoner of war, there were thousands more to take his place in battle. In the U.S., at Lake Success in late June, Soviet delegate Yakub Malik made an unexpected suggestion.
The Soviet people believe that as a first step, discussions should be started between the belligerents for a ceasefire and an armistice, providing for the mutual withdrawal of forces from the 38th parallel. Can such a step be taken? I think it can, provided there is a sincere desire to put an end to the bloody fighting in Korea.
In Tokyo, a week later, the commander of UN forces in Korea composed a message addressed to the leader of the communist troops. The message was recorded and ordered broadcast in English, Korean, and Chinese by all radio stations on the home islands of Japan, which could reach northern Korea.
As Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command, I have been instructed to communicate to you the following. I am informed that you may wish a meeting to discuss an armistice providing for the cessation of hostilities and all acts of armed force in Korea, with adequate guarantees for the maintenance of such armistice. Upon the receipt of word from you that such a meeting is desired, I shall be prepared to name my representative. I would also, at that time, suggest a date at which he could meet with your representative. Signed, Matthew B. Ridgway, General, United States Army, Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command.
In their reply, the communists suggested Kaesong, just south of the parallel, as the site.
I have received your message dated 6 July. I agree to your plan of movement of your liaison group from Pyongyang, Virasarian, and Namchamjan to Kaesong, leaving Pyongyang at 0500 Pyongyang time on 7 July in 5 jeeps and 5 motor transports carrying white flags. This convoy will be immune from attack by my forces during its travel from Pyongyang to Kaesong. In addition, the area within a 5-mile radius from the center of Kaesong will be observed by me as a neutral zone from the time of arrival of your delegates in Kaesong.
On July 10th, after one preliminary meeting, the UN negotiators prepared to take off from Munsan for the first actual ceasefire talks. General Ridgway had appointed U.S. Vice Admiral Charles Turner Joy head of the delegation for the United Nations. The UN truce team took off on schedule at 9:45 a.m. At Kaesong, the first major South Korean town to fall to the invaders, a large Korean private house provided the setting for the meetings. North Korean General Nam-il, Red Chief, and U.S. Admiral Joy and their respective delegations approached their task earnestly. Theoretically, at least, these men had it in their power to effect peace. The meetings at Kaesong continued on and on, with no agreement being reached through the midsummer weeks. The war on the battlefront continued as the delegates talked to no avail. On August 4th, a column of Chinese communist soldiers, heavily armed with weapons of all types, passed through the neutral zone in direct violation of the original agreement. And after a strong UN protest against this flagrant transgression, the truce negotiations ended abruptly. On the front in Central Korea, U.S. GIs and Marines waged a limited offensive. Troops of other UN countries were now fighting in Korea. More than 1,000 Ethiopians were in action, and some 5,000 Filipinos formed a regimental combat team under UN command. Canada was represented by a brigade group. In all, 16 member nations of the UN were committing military force. In September, the first airborne operation by helicopter in military history was conducted by U.S. Marines. This novel airlift brought the fighting men to the top of a 3,800-foot peak, ready to go into action against the enemy force which held the surrounding territory. This new type of landing ruled out the necessity for the Marines to make a grueling 2-day march overland. Instead, the fighting men arrived at the vital spot, fresh and ready for action, and they had the high ground without having to seize it from below. The assault by helicopter succeeded in landing 220 men and some 8 tons of equipment. In Japan, General Ridgway worked toward a revival of truce negotiations.
To Generals Kim Il-sung and Peng Tae-hwai, your message to me, dated 1 September 1951 and received 2 September, is yet another of your false charges in which, without the slightest basis in fact, you have again impugned the good faith of the United Nations forces. I have stated and will again positively state that our thorough investigations have indicated no instances where forces under my command have violated any of the agreements made by me or my representatives. Therefore, if the incidents did in fact occur, they were presumably initiated and perpetrated by your forces in order to provide spurious evidence for false and malevolent accusations against the United Nations command. I propose that our liaison officers meet immediately at the bridge at Panmunjom to discuss the selection of a new site where negotiations can be continued without interruption. Signed, M.B. Ridgway, General, United States Army, Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command. That is all.
The new site for the negotiations was 6 miles south of the old meeting place at Kaesong. Both sides were eager to resume the discussions after the 63-day interval. To make certain that pilots on both sides would be able to identify the area instantly, and that therefore there would be no further incidents, barrage balloons were raised above the site. On October 25th, Admiral Joy and his delegation arrived at Panmunjom to try again to reach a ceasefire agreement with the enemy. At first, the Reds had been uncompromising about the question of the extent of the neutral zone, but they suddenly became conciliatory and accepted the UN proposals. Finally, after a series of meetings, an agreement was reached on a provisional truce line, with the front at that time serving as the demarcation line between North and South Korea, if an armistice could be reached within 30 days. The battle line as of that moment was finally agreed upon. But the big problem still remained, the achieving of a formal ceasefire. Officially, the war was still on. But at the front, the troops observed an unofficial ceasefire while awaiting developments in the negotiations. Just in case, all the UN troops, like the British Tommies and the Belgians, prepared to let the enemy have it. The Greeks and the Americans took the opportunity to relax a bit, but none of the UN troops dared hope that the war might be coming to an end. However, while the men on the ground took a breather, the air offensive continued unabated. American pilots of World War II planes like the B-29s flew mission after mission against enemy troop concentrations, supply dumps, and lines of communication north of the 38th parallel in Korea. In Mig Alley over North Korea, American jets went to work on enemy targets of all types. From time to time, the Russian-built MiGs gave battle. In the 700-mile-per-hour air war of the jets over Korea, the communists suffered heavy losses. On December 18th, 1951, the first lists of Korean war prisoners were exchanged. The communist roster of UN prisoners checked by UN forces at Munsan, South Korea, included 11,559 names, about 80,000 short of the total of UN troops missing. The communist list was viewed with skepticism by UN forces. There was no immediate way of verifying the accuracy or inaccuracy of the roster. But the publication of the list brought great joy to many Americans. Among them, Mrs. William Dean, wife of the missing commander of the U.S. 24th Division.
We've had a feeling that he was a prisoner of war, and that's why this news, coming as it has made us all feel so happy, because it's the first real definite news that we've had, and it's a fact.
In Korea, the United Nations was faced with another considerable problem: the rehabilitation of a nation ripped to tatters by the bloody war which raged up and down the Korean peninsula. The people of Korea, numbed by the agonies of war, worked toward the rebuilding of their nation. But this reconstruction of a country which had enjoyed only a brief period of peaceful independence was not a simple matter. Everyone pitched in to build again on the rubble of what had once been Korea. Some Koreans could not remember what it was like before war came to their country. Some had been refugees since birth. Fortunately, the young recover quickly, and the future citizens of Korea experienced a new joy in living. Perhaps in a brighter tomorrow, they might even forget the long, tragic months of war. But Korea will always remain a symbol of the fight against the forces which seek to enslave the peoples of the world. In San Francisco, the war which had raged across the broad expanse of Pacific Ocean came to a formal end.
As we approach the peace table, let us be free of malice and hate, to the end that from here on there shall be neither victors nor vanquished among us, but only equals in the partnership of peace.
After a decade, the war which had turned the Pacific Asiatic basin into a vast battleground was finally terminated. Just 20 years after Japan embarked on the road of aggression. But that peace was not all-encompassing. In Korea, at that same moment, American fighting men were battling a new aggressor. In the hills and valleys of that peninsula, the free nations were making a stand to keep that aggressor from overrunning all of Asia and the world. Asia in the 20th century seemed to the world beyond its shores just as unfathomable as it had for centuries past. The inscrutable East seemed far beyond the ken of the peoples of the Western world. The heritage of the people of the Asiatic Pacific lands has little in common with Western traditions. The culture of the peoples of Asia has remained virtually unchanged by the passage of centuries. And throughout Asia, life for millions of Asiatic peoples of differing racial stocks has very little from the life of their ancestors thousands of years ago. But though that life is essentially simple, life for the Asian has an infinite variety of facets. His values are often incomprehensible to an outsider. The overwhelming majority of Asians believe in a divine being. Whether Confucian, Taoist, Hindu, or Buddhist, the Asian feels a strong sense of oneness with his God, with the universe, and with the recurring cycle of time, which makes his own lifespan a part of the main current of life throughout the centuries. One of the principal religions of Asia is Islam, practiced by millions of followers of the Prophet Muhammad. The Muslims' holy book, the Quran, repeats a single theme: there is no God but God. Like the Christians and Jews of the Western world, the Muslims believe that both God and the immortal soul of man have definite characteristics. Some 300 million people in Asia are Hindus. Their religion teaches that the individual recognizes only one element in man and nature, to which his attachment must be absolute, the supreme soul of the universe. For centuries, Hinduism relegated all its practitioners into separate castes. Those castes were completely rigid. The Hindu of whatever class was bound to his group. His day-to-day life followed the prescribed pattern of his caste. Though the observance of the caste system has been legally outlawed in the India of today, Hinduism itself still exerts a powerful influence over the life and thought of much of the Asian world. The basic problem of Asia lies in its tremendous population. The lives of millions of Asians are spent in abject misery. Throughout great areas of Asia, there is not enough food to sustain life for much of the population. In the enlightened 20th century, millions of Asia's people are homeless and starving. In many parts of that vast area of the Earth's surface, the most primitive methods of distributing vitally needed food are still employed. Throughout the centuries, Asia has not been able to feed its people. The land under cultivation produces a far smaller yield than it would if the farmers were to use more advanced methods and equipment. But in most of the countries of southern and eastern Asia, the farmer pursued his time-honored tasks in the same manner as his great-great-grandfather had before him. On the solution of that food problem rested the future of Asia and its relation with the Western world. In the atomic age, that development was an urgent necessity if southern and eastern Asia were to become a strong part of the free world. For the rice paddies of Asia were the setting for one of the principal showdown battles against the further advance of communism. In Indochina, French troops dug out communist guerrillas one by one in an exhausting war which continued month after month. Impressive advances were scored by French forces, and the area thoroughly scoured for communists. But usually the French troops would find the same area in need of cleaning out once more. More and more French troops were committed to the battle. Indochina's interior was one more raging battleground on which the fight against the communist aggressors was being waged under the most difficult circumstances. The Orient first exerted a strong appeal to American business interests more than 100 years ago. In the early years of the 20th century, American concern with the affairs of Asia grew to greater proportions. Along the coast of the Asian mainland, especially in China's large port cities, the stamp of American business was much in evidence. As the 20th century progressed, China's large population centers assumed even more of an Occidental cast. The westernization of China's principal cities had a marked influence on the lives of many of its people. And the presence of American business firms in the Orient directly affected some thousands who took an active part in the gradual process of conversion to modern methods. To protect all American interests in the Orient in the years preceding World War II, small detachments of U.S. Marines were stationed in cities like Shanghai, charged with the responsibility of keeping the U.S. out of any Asiatic squabbles, and yet never permitting any situation to develop in which the United States would lose face in Oriental eyes. The development of Asiatic countries has been a matter of increasing importance to the United States during the past few decades. Beginning in 1945, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, instituted a program to help countries like China face their critical problem in readjusting to 20th century methods of development. For more than 2 years, UNRWA shipments, largely from the United States, contributed materially to the gradual economic advancement of a number of Asian countries. Soon after UNRWA ceased to function in 1947, the U.S. Economic Cooperation Administration set about helping the job of rehabilitation on a somewhat more ambitious scale. Over a period of 45 months, Asian countries received almost $1 billion in ECA funds, with the largest part of that allocation going to China. The immediate aim of ECA help was to rescue war-ravaged lands from poverty and at the same time promote goodwill and friendship with the U.S. among the peoples of those lands. But this concrete economic assistance did not prevent China's collapse. The country was overrun by the communists in 1949. The nationalist government moved to the island haven of Formosa. On that island sanctuary, the nationalists rebuilt their military forces toward the day when the China mainland might be liberated. U.S. Army officers instructed the Chinese soldiers in the use of the newest weapons and intensified training in all phases necessary in the achievement of an effective fighting force. The Chinese army on Formosa numbered some 500,000 men, but many of those needed instruction in the most elementary phases of warfare. Formosa itself benefited greatly by the recent developments. With a major assist from ECA, Formosa's power system, built during the years of Japanese occupation, was reconstructed and streamlined. Within a 2-year period, the U.S. spent more than $5 million on major improvements to Formosa's power system. The railroad lines were rebuilt as part of the program to integrate Formosa's economy. Some hundreds of thousands of dollars were allocated for use in the rehabilitation of Formosa's industry. But by far the most important contribution was made in the reorganization of the country's farm economy. Under the new land rent reform program, Formosan farmers could procure new contracts, whereby the rent to the landlord was limited to 37.5% of the crop instead of twice that amount. For Formosa's several million farmers, this change marked the end of a life of near starvation. The ECA also provided vitally needed fertilizer, which enriched the land and increased the size and quality of the farmers' crops. This unprecedented program of land rent reform and instruction in scientific farming was underwritten by the U.S. Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction, working with ECA funds. It afforded Formosa's farmers for the first time a sense of security. On the 14,000 square mile island of Formosa, the first steps were taken toward a possible solution of the problem which was besetting all Asian lands. During the years following World War II, U.S. aid to the nations of Southern and Eastern Asia increased, with the emphasis placed more and more on military rather than on economic assistance. Hundreds of U.S. planes were delivered to Indochina and Thailand, concrete support for the defense of those countries against communist aggression. A parade through the streets of Saigon, Indochina's capital, was staged to impress the people. The U.S. also concentrated strongly on improving health conditions in the countries of Southern and Eastern Asia. For the prevention of disease and the introduction of modern medical facilities were, in a very real sense, just as important to a nation's recovery as economic or military aid. In the years following the end of World War II, American assistance of several types was bringing the United States closer to the personal lives of millions of Asians. That bond was a most important factor in the struggle to keep Asia from becoming a communist continent. But the most powerful contribution to that crusade was being made in Korea. On that peninsula on the rim of the Asian mainland, the forces of the United Nations were taking their first positive joint action in resisting open aggression. A memorable forward step in the campaign to defend any nation attacked in any part of the globe. That campaign against the aggressor in Korea was a punishing one for thousands of American fighting men. The UN troops fought well against almost overwhelming opposition. But the outnumbered UN soldiers continued to attack. In beating back the enemy advances, United Nations forces suffered heavily. During the first year and a half of the Korean War, U.S. casualties totaled almost half the number of American casualties sustained during the 4 years of World War II in the Pacific. As usual, it was the men with the rifles who were hit hardest. With the backing of the peoples of many nations, the fight against the forces of slavery would be continued in the crusade for freedom in Asia and the Pacific and throughout the world. In the past 26 installments, Crusade in the Pacific has documented the history of the Pacific Asiatic world over a 20-year period. Today, that part of the world is a matter of greatest concern to the United States. For the future of the Pacific Asiatic world and the future of the United States are indissolubly linked. The peoples of that vast area are well aware of the urgent necessity for mutual understanding if a lasting peace is to be achieved. I would like to introduce Mr. Kentaro Buma of Japan. Would you tell us, Mr. Buma, what you consider to be the obstacles we must overcome to arrive at that closer understanding?
I think one of the strongest factors which has prevented that understanding for so many years is the great dissimilarity in our cultures. The Asian attitude towards life and what is most important thing in life is quite different from the Western. Oriental religions induce a fatalistic attitude towards what happens to the individual in the present. Man's spiritual life is of much more importance than his material well-being. The individual identifies himself much more closely with the stream of life throughout the ages. I think that recently, many Americans have come to understand Asian peoples a little better. I hope they realize that even though there are differences in our background, we should be able to arrive at a satisfactory relation of our points of view in our effort to create a better world for all peoples.
Mr. Pesek, what are the biggest problems facing Indonesia and the other Asian countries which became independent after World War II?
Americans must remember that Indonesia and young independent nations of Asia have jumped right from the horse and buggy age to the airplane age. The 20th century is moving in on the peoples of Asia with lightning speed. Changes which were made gradually in European countries over a span of centuries are being assimilated in Asian lands in a few short years. Changing our whole way of life virtually overnight is a difficult process, inevitably accompanied by a certain amount of growing pains. Americans should try to remember that in these days of our infancy, as independent nations, we are faced with many overwhelming problems, many of which confronted the United States when it was a young republic.
And now I'd like to introduce Mirza Muzaffar Shikoh of Pakistan. Mr. Shikoh, do the peoples of Southern and Eastern Asia consider communism a menace?
Not the way the Americans do. The average Asian does not understand communism in its political sense. But many hungry people have been led to believe that communism may provide more food than they currently have. While it is true that the spiritual aspect of life is the most important for an Asian, he still thinks of the stomach. To many Asians, communism may be a danger, but it is a danger they have not yet experienced. And to some Asians, anything is preferable to that type of life which they experienced under the old colonial administrations. Communist propaganda in Southern and Eastern Asia has been very subtle indeed, and I should say very effective. The communists examine the situation existing in each country and take advantage of whatever discontent they find. American propaganda since World War II has been rather too broad and not attuned to the special problems of each country. I sincerely hope that a greater mutual understanding develops between the United States and our people before communism has a chance to engulf all of Asia.
Perhaps Mr. M.S. Dave of India will tell us what he thinks American policy in Asia should be.
The principal concern of the people of Asia today is national freedom and economic development. In the international chess game between the two great powers, the free nations of Asia would prefer not to be pawns. Our countries have much in common with the West, but our people would like to feel that they are making their choice freely without any outside pressure. There is much to be gained both by the East and the West if our people and the people of the United States develop that bond of friendship and mutual understanding.
That basis of a closer understanding requires the concerted efforts of the nations involved. Many Americans are aware of the problems which must be overcome in forging a strong bond between the East and the West. Men like John Foster Dulles, architect of the peace treaty with Japan.
Progress is being made, although the opposite sometimes seems to be the case. Today, the East and the West are approaching closer understanding. The old order of Western colonialism has died. Communists hope that its ghost will flutter to frighten the Asian peoples so that they will shrink away from the West. That, of course, would mean not Asia for the Asians, but Asia for the Russians. We in the United States feel a newborn sense of responsibility to help to dispel the fears that paralyze and divide the free peoples. In Japan, we have an illustration that we can cooperate on a basis of equality, even with former enemies of another race. We shall show, wherever opportunity offers, that the free West can join hands with the free East in equal fellowship to preserve our common freedom and our cultures and our civilizations. Thus, working together, we shall set an example which will stir the souls not only of the free, but of those who, now in captivity to despotism, still cherish love of freedom.
Go forward, men of courage, in the freedom fight. Let every tyrant feel your might. For freedom and justice.